Welcome to Season 2 of the Project Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer. As many of you know, I am a cult survivor myself. For anyone interested, you can hear the story of how I got in and how I got out in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. The beginning of this year, 2023, actually marks my 11 years of being out, and I am so super grateful for the ways my life has unfolded since. I now work with survivors of coercive control, and I'm going to take a moment here to define this term, as one of my heart's desires is to help society at large better understand coercive control in cases that are not just culty, but across the globe I view coercive control as a social issue. It's at the heart of cases where women and girls are murdered. We find coercive control in one-to-one relationships that are intimate, in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults of all types. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and I'm just beginning a new element of my career as an expert witness for legal cases that involve coercive control. As a certified trauma professional, I work with survivors. I'm especially excited to be offering a group survivor program for cult and religious abuse recovery. So this is not a support group, but rather a healing program. It's based on my certification in the incredible work of Dr. Jilly Jenkinson, who gathered decades of research on survivors to create a body of work that I would consider to be the most comprehensive and flexible approach I've come across in this field. We will meet every other week for 6 months, and registration will open in February of 2023 for those interested. Lastly, I am also a research associate at Salford University and explore topics related to coercive control. So let's jump back into a basic understanding of coercive control before I introduce the next episode. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. The victim's everyday existence is micromanaged, and their space for action, as well as potential as a human being, is limited and controlled by the abuser. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Then gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. The abuser creates an unreal world of contradiction, confusion, and fear. It may be helpful to know that 51% of victims do not even know that they are being abused, manipulated, and controlled. Coercive control correlates significantly to serious harm, and in many cases, in intimate partner violence, it precedes homicide. These can be difficult topics to grapple with. So I truly hope that this podcast helps to protect you and those you love with helpful voices and information. If you appreciate the podcast, please let us know by subscribing and comment with kindness. And always think critically, trust your intuition, and be free. Anke Richter is a columnist and reporter. Her investigative and personal features have been published in Die Zeit, Spiegel, Faz, Taz. That's it for the publications that might be difficult for me to pronounce. New Zealand Geographic, North and South, the Spinoff, Canvas, and others. These are publications you would likely find internationally across the world. She has written 3 previous books and currently lives in New Zealand. I also want to read the description of her most recent book called Cult Trip for you all so that you might get a flavor for Anke and breadth. So that you might get a flavor for Anke, the breadth of work in the cultiverse over so that you might get a flavor for Anke and the breadth of her work in the cultiverse over the past decade, and a little insight into the book itself. So the header states, a leading journalist's personal, intense, and riveting investigation into the worlds of cults. At a New Age festival in Byron Bay, Australia, German journalist Anke Richter is finding her spiritual awakening when she meets a woman, a survivor of the Centrepoint cult, who will change the course of her life and career. Over the next 10 years, Anke pursued a labyrinthine investigation into how and why cults attract, entrap, and destroy otherwise ordinary people, asking what the line is between tribe and cult, participant and perpetrator, seduction and sexual abuse. From the emotional and criminal carnage of Centrepoint in Auckland, New Zealand, to an anti-cult conference in Manchester, the infamous Osho's ashram in India, the Tantric Agama Yoga school in remote Thailand, and culminating in a visit to Gloriavale on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island, Anke uncovers a disturbing pattern of violence and suffering. International bestseller Cult Trip is a powerful exploration of what really goes on inside the groups we call cults and how to reckon with the aftermath. You will hear me speak to the book throughout our interview, but to say a few words here, it's really a wonderful deep dive into the world of a few cults, very fascinating in and of themselves, but Anke weaves threads of connectedness between and through them. This also dovetails with her own life, and so we get to journey through these stories with both survivor voices at the center, as well as Anke's experience and engagement with these groups and individuals. It is a wild ride and so beautifully written, with educational insights along the way. I'm so grateful for Anke's body of work, raising awareness for cult survivors, and also her advocacy to protect the public and educate about these abusive groups. Please be sure to check out the show notes for all of the references mentioned during our interview. We also have a special discount link to Cult Trip for this audience, so please be sure to purchase the book at a massively discounted price. And now, please join us for part 1 of our 3-part interview with Anke Richter. So thank you, Anke Richter, for joining us on the Project Hope podcast today. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, Jennifer, it's fantastic to be here. Finally, we've made it happen.
We have. Yes, all the way from New Zealand to the U.S. So, Anke, this book was just amazing on many levels, Cult Trip. Our audience will hear a little bit more about it in the introduction. But it's really a treat to have you here because it's quite rare, actually, that I get to interview somebody who's a journalist. And what a role you have played, and what an exploration you have done, and what an impact on certain lives also from your reporting, which I think I can speak for our entire audience that we are so grateful for voices like yours that are bringing, the complications of these things to light. And I think that's what I really loved about Cult Trip, is that we get to intimately explore kind of these three different culty environments with you. And so it truly is these stories and exploration through the voices of the survivors. And yet you're also on your own journey. And so we really get some of your personal insights, your considerations. And I think that's where I really related as a cult survivor, but also just being in this field as, I guess, a survivor helper, just so relating to what that experience is when you are in this kind of content and you're really caring about the people who you're reporting on. I mean, it's really such a responsibility. So we'll certainly go into some more around that later on, but just to kind of set the audience up a little bit with that general format. And then I think if we could just begin, Anke, by if you don't mind sharing a little bit kind of about your history and what led you to this wild trip of life and journalism.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, it's been a wild life. That's true. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I live in New Zealand, but I'm originally from Germany. Immigrated to New Zealand about 20 years ago. Yeah, it's actually been 20 years this coming month. I've been a journalist actually since I left school. My training was in Los Angeles. I spent 2 years in Los Angeles working for a foreign correspondent. Actually, it's where I came across Scientology for the first time. So my interest in cults was already peaked and then. And also going back to Germany, Scientology was a big topic back then. There was a lot of protest against them. So I was always close to that, interest in that, fascinated in groups in general. I think it also had to do with me spending a year at a Rudolf Steiner, a Waldorf boarding school in England, which I absolutely loved. And that was my first experience, I guess, being in a little more closed-off community with a very different vibe to my home life and my German school and all of that. So I think a part of me has always been looking for let's say alternative communities in whatever way. I was always dreaming of living at a kibbutz at some stage. And when I was in my 30s, as a family, then married with our little son, we spent 7 months on a small atoll in the South Pacific. My husband was the island doctor there. That became my second book in German. So I've always been drawn. I mean, I'm a natural explorer, adventurer. I probably choose journalism, so I have excuses to go into strange and different worlds and get paid for it and get more insight because I can ask everyone about their experiences too. So I think all of this has contributed to me always maybe also looking for what's sort of outside the norm and the mundane life, but also into closed off communities. Have always fascinated me. And we have a lot of them here in New Zealand, by the way, a lot of intentional communities. Some of them are really lovely, lovely places. They're not culty. And still they sort of have their own vibe sometimes and their own culture. So I'm this whole overlap or this gray zone between alternative living and when does it turn into something more sinister, more problematic. I guess that's been a big part of my life besides being a journalist. Yeah.
Fascinating. And yes. And I feel you kind of grappling with that or considering that as we journey through the content of the book together, that it really, the nuances of the different layers of it all as well is just fascinating. So I'm curious just about the Rudolf Steiner School and how old you were at that time, because in the US, I'm used to that being an experience for very young children. I don't know if that exists here, like a boarding school, which I would assume would maybe be in the US, we use like middle school, 7th grade.
I'm pretty sure you'll find Steiner schools in the US as well that go all the way through high school, because they are everywhere around the world. And so that was also a school with a high school. So I was 16. And my mother was quite steeped in anthroposophy, and so there are a lot of culty aspects to that movement as well. So I guess I've always had a foot in, at least in some movements and groups. I had my Christian phase when I was 13. So it was before I went to England, to this school in England. I had a Christian phase at the local YMCA. I was a youth group leader, and we sang songs around the campfire. And I was in love with Jesus, and I was probably more in love with, the whole vibe. And then Jesus was the standard for all that. So I think in those formative years, that'd be interesting for a psychotherapist, how all this is meshed together. But I guess in those formative years, maybe with my emerging romantic feelings also for others, and at the same time then being in groups like those, or in communities, or like the sporting school, it does plant a seed that we always think there is more connection, there is a certain sort of type of love. I went to this big I'm just remembering now that you took me down on this trip down memory lane. I once went to a summer camp as well. It was for Protestant and Catholic youth in France. Thésée, a very famous, I think you call it, anyway, it's like when the Catholics and the Protestants come together, don't know the English word, forgive me. And it was a big summer camp, and I had a little thing with a boy there, first kiss and whatnot. And again, it was, but the sugarcoating around it all, or the setting was also a religious setting and a group experience. Everyone was loved up on the summer camp. So, fast forward, gosh, how many years? And I've just been to a summer camp a few years ago. In Sweden, where adults come together. It's not religious, but they do body work and relational work. And so this whole idea of a summer camp and people coming together and experiencing something, I think it's always had an appeal for me. Yeah. And now I have mixed feelings about it, as we will probably find out why.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. And I think also that is one of the threads that I kind of felt with you, that I think is something that is shared commonly with so many cult survivors, that for those who actually kind of choose to go in, that often there's a desire for just real connection, real honest conversation and real connection. And so it was also interesting to me sort of feeling that in your journey, that you're also able to turn to journalism as some form of that, actually, that you're having to ask people these very challenging questions that are quite personal or very intimate. So just tracking the thread. If we go into this exploration of the 3 different cults that get featured, and really it ends up kind of being 4, but tell us a little bit, if you would, about Centrepoint and what led you to this project. I was fascinated by this one, Anke, because I know I actually did watch some of the film that's out there on Centrepoint, but other than that, I haven't found a ton on it. So it was especially interesting to journey into it in the way that you were exposed to it. And that helped me to understand maybe why there's not a ton of information as well.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, Jennifer, that you didn't find much about it, because Centrepoint stayed under the radar globally, mainly because when it all folded, it was before the internet, or when the court cases happened, it was before the internet. So all the press coverage from back then, you wouldn't just find online. And New Zealand is a little country at the bottom of the world, but even on a global scale, I would say Centrepoint was quite unmatched, or the only other cult they were matched by. And interestingly, ran at the same time, and they actually inspired each other, because some Centrepointians brought some ideas back from there, was Otto Mühl's commune in Austria. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Friedrichshof. They were a very radical, very promiscuous, very anarchist group as well. But okay, so let me tell you how I came across Centrepoint and what they were. So I hadn't heard about them either when I moved to New Zealand. When I first set foot here, actually, this is when the commune was just being, when they had just been through the courts, and their trust was changed, and Centrepoint was finally officially over. But they had a 20-year history, longer. They were started in the late 1970s by Bert Potter, a very, well, apparently charismatic former pest control salesman, self-proclaimed therapist from the human potential movement. So he'd gone to Esalen in California, very wild and fascinating, and probably a highly problematic place in those days. Brought back all these teachings like Gestalt and encounter groups, and also around sexuality and experimenting with psychedelics. And he also went to Osho's ashram in Pune. I mean, back then Osho was called himself, he was Rajneesh or Bhagwan. And I guess Bert Potter learned the spoons of how to be a guru, called himself God. But here in New Zealand, he was a big deal in the therapy scene, because back then there wasn't much counseling. There were really only just churches, and maybe especially around if you had any sexual problems or wanted any help in that regard, there was your doctor, and that was it. So Bert Potter arrived on the scene, and a lot of social services sent their people to him. A lot of therapists flocked to him. His workshops became the thing, and he started. They finally started a community, bought a big piece of land, and they were mainly white middle class people, doctors and lawyers and nurses and school teachers. They started this community, so they weren't obvious sort of radical hippies of any sorts. They were really into therapy and also into opening up relationships. So they had this dogma, this free love dogma, which in my books is not even true polyamory, because it was really enforced. And so most of the couples and families that moved there, the parents split up, the kids were left to themselves, which is not unusual. It happens in most other cultic groups as well, where the children actually neglected because their parents either have to work so hard for the bigger cause, or in the case of Centrepoint, they were constantly busy with their own self-development and in workshops or in new relationships or going off for a quickie in the bushes. So Centrepoint had this very open sexual environment. Fast forward, 20 years later, it was raided, 15 years later, it was raided by the police with allegations for sexual child abuse and manufacturing drugs. And in fact, Centrepoint, they had big sessions where they took MDMA together with teenagers, and every third child at Centrepoint has been sexually abused. That came out later in a study as well that university did here. So that's probably what Centrepoint is now most renowned for, infamous for, is the sexual child abuse, that it's seen as this pedophile commune, which is probably not quite accurate, because I would say most people who lived there weren't pedophiles as such, or didn't go there because they wanted a space to abuse children, but it came about with the philosophy of opening up sexually and free children, and also having a charismatic leader who was a predator, and others there, men and women, who had this warped philosophy of that it's great for teenagers to be sexually open. Well, I can tell you a lot more about it all. It was a massive stain on New Zealand's social history, one that hasn't really been resolved, and I only came across it in 2012 because I went to a neo-Tantra festival in Australia, and that was part of my personal curiosity, which we can talk about more why that was. And also I was going to write a piece, more like a humorous and a fluff piece about it for a magazine here in New Zealand. And there I met a woman called Anke Richter, who'd been a teenager at Centrepoint, and she said that she was the concubine of the commune concubine, and that she lived in a sex cult when she was young. And I was quite fascinated by that. And then I learned that Bill Potter had just died, and Angie was ready to talk about him. So we set off to do a book together. I thought, wow, this is a massive story for, New Zealand is a small country, not so many big things happening over the years. This is a massive sex and drugs and cult scandal. Why has no one written a book about it? And I got a publisher, and I set off to do this task, and then lost myself in it. So 2 years down that track, I'd entered this labyrinth of conflicting stories of unresolved trauma, because 20 years had passed since all this happened. So people had dispersed, there had been court cases, people had gone to jail, but there hadn't been any kind of collective reconciliation or collective reckoning, or what we in Germany call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, in regards to the Third Reich, which means coming to terms with your past. None of that had happened, and people who'd lived at Centrepoint were just ashamed to be associated with it. The children as well. Some of them who were not sexual abuse victims were more traumatized or felt more damaged by the stigma that they felt when they came out, and how people thought about them and judged their former home and their families. So it was a massive, unresolved mess. And I stepped into that, maybe naively, but not too naive, because I thought, well, I've written 3 books before, interviewed this woman, fascinating story, try and get these court files, and boom, it's a book. And it wasn't as straightforward as that. And do you want to hear a bit more about that?
I do, because I was actually quite curious. I know that there's some period of time kind of between this and then your personal transition of heading over to Osho's place in India, and you made kind of a little reference. I wondered if it was okay for me to ask you about this, that there was a little reference of kind of around that time that there had been kind of a fallout around something, maybe a project or something that you were working on. And it sounded like it was also around this time when the Centrepoint book maybe fell through, or so I was curious.
Yeah, there is a bit of a timeline. So the Centrepoint book in the end fell through, right? I pulled the plug, or actually my publisher got a cold feet because there were legal threats. The person that signed me up in the publishing house had left. I was completely on my own. I had no guidance. I had no one to talk to. I finally found a mentor and a pro bono lawyer who helped me with, just sort of sifting through some of the worst conflicting material and how to handle that. But I was utterly alone and quite affected, 2 years into it all, quite affected by the stories I'd heard. I had vicarious trauma. I was later diagnosed with that, actually, with PTSD from doing this research. Yeah. So.
Oh, and to be alone in it, I can't even imagine, honestly. And at that time, I know that there was some information. I know also I picked up that you went to an ICSA ICSA conference. But really, at that time, the resources also, when you're in that content, you really do need some support, or to just even have support of understanding some of the dynamics, because it's so complex, right?
Absolutely. And ICSA and support and therapy and all these things only came much later. So I fell into it just as a journalist, my journalistic mind, like, oh, this is a story. I'm writing a book. Sure. I just find all these people, I interview them, put it all together. I had a great publisher. What I didn't understand, because I hadn't come close to cult survivors until then, I didn't understand the cultiverse, so to speak, and the emotional fallout of it all and the toll it takes. I didn't foresee that I would be dealing with so many unresolved issues and people so deeply damaged. And maybe also because this had been festering for 20 years for some people. I came across one woman, Louise Wynn, she's in my book, as the girl in the caravan. She had never told anyone her story, and she was possibly, or is possibly, the most severely abused victim of Centrepoint. She barricaded herself in her caravan with junk at 11 years old, so men couldn't come to her at night. And she was utterly alone. So, if we talk about me being utterly alone, I was doing my job. I wasn't, but I met people who were so struggling still and who'd had such horrific stories. So, I don't want to focus too much on how hard it was for me, because I was just affected by how awful it had been for others. And I didn't really see that coming. I didn't know what a cesspool it was, and that I basically bitten off more than I could chew. So 2 years in, a friend of mine also died at that time. I was going through grief. My publisher was being difficult in terms of the deadline. They didn't want to give me more time. I think they just wanted to get it over and done with, and were probably getting cold feet about how much this would cost them in legal costs just to go through it. And then I paused the book, thought I just need a big break. I went on a silent meditation retreat and then in the end, I just didn't have it in me anymore. And I buried it, which was a massive defeat. It was a massive professional failure for me. And not just professionally, but I also felt I let those women down, like Angie and Louise, who'd given me, so much of their time, their story, who trusted me and who thought this is going to change something and open people's eyes. And what I could only do in the end was I wrote the making of as a big magazine story here in New Zealand. It was nominated for an award in the end. So it had a ripple effect. People came out of the woodwork after that. One woman, a survivor herself, started the Centrepoint restoration project. Two documentaries followed. The one that you probably watched was, it's come from my article and also working on the documentary then later. So there was a roll-on effect. It just wasn't that book. So, and then it's taken me a few more years and another publisher, HarperCollins, to actually knock on my door, and I went back into my old manuscript, which I thought I'd never look at again. This is that, it's done. Closed that lid, and I opened it again and reworked some of it, left out the bits that I just couldn't get over the line legally, or where it was just too many open ends, or people who had freaked out. Also some of the whistleblowers who I'd finally found, people who were whistleblowers at the time, who did want to go to the police or make it public, who spoke up at Centrepoint, who raised the alarm, who said we are not freeing children, we are abusing them. People who, they were also suffering from PTSD. And then to hear from a journalist all these years later, I thought I would give them a chance to find each other's story, and they freaked and threatened me legally as well. So some of the legal threats I had actually came from people who were on the right side, so to speak. And some of the nicest and friendliest people were some of the worst abusers there. So it became so conflicting for me. And now in hindsight, it's good that I stopped, and I'm glad I had a second chance. And then I added more to it, a few more other groups. But come back to your question around the timeline and what happened when. So ICSA and everything only came much, much later. And so Centrepoint came first. I stopped it. But at that time, I was already involved in a group which sounds similar to ICSA, but it's actually, it's not an anti-cult organization, but it's the International School of Temple Arts, ISTA, yeah? Very similar name. And I was doing courses with them. And I think they're a neo-Tantra shamanic group and the movement, and they hold lots of trainings. And I see them very critical now, but at the time, it was amazing for me to go there and do trainings with them. And I think that also played a part in me wanting to understand Centrepoint, because the people who'd founded Centrepoint, apart from the fact that they were all into this guru book Potter, but their motivation to do work on themselves to do this human potential type therapy. Some of these bits were actually in ISTA trainings as well, like cushion banging and screaming into your hand and get it all out of your system and all this cathartic stuff. And also opening up their relationships. I mean, all this was fascinating to me and not completely foreign. It was something I could relate to. And I thought, wow, what did go wrong there? So I felt almost an obligation to investigate Centrepoint because I had skin in the game. Yeah, I was invested in a group at the same time personally, even though I was keeping that on the down low, where I thought there's a lot of good for me, and there was. I got my goal, but then I also had my blind spots around what wasn't so good there. And the irony of all this and of my book, and maybe also the honesty of it all. My book is also that while I was researching all these cults, I was possibly part of one too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and for those of us steeped in the cultiverse, it's no surprise.
I'm jealous. I mean, what more validation do you need? Maybe we're all weak and stupid, including me. But I mean, I'm the living example of people who, think they have a sharp mind, who investigate these things, who are critical thinkers and all of that. And still, we are all susceptible. Something can land. We all have a part of us in us that wants to connect, wants to learn, wants to grow, wants something out of life. And if it's offered to you at the right time in the right environment, you're hooked. Yeah.
Yes. So may I go back into the Centrepoint story for a moment before we move on? And there were just some areas, Anke, where as I'm reading it, it's like these amazing descriptions that help, again, through the voice of survivors often, that help us to understand also this complexity that you're faced with, that as the journalist, here you are approaching these stories. It seems like it should be pretty black and white, what's good, what's bad. But as you enter into each individual's mentality, you get to really see how, like, the philosophy of the group seeps in and where it starts to shift people's mindset, and how even with, I was fascinated. I think it's Ulrich, the gentleman that was convicted, that was actually
the drug chemist, yeah.
And that he was also abusing young girls. So
and just to throw that in, and survivors like Louise had told me that they felt safe around him. So he was also seen as the good guy to others. So this is how conflicting it can get. Yeah, sorry, carry on. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's just so. There's a piece here. Let's see. I'm not sure. Oh, it is his voice. And this kind of describes it, I think. So he shares something with you, and now he's kind of smiling, like the information that he just gave you is like a revelation for you, or it'll be a big help to the research. I love the little lines that you have in here like that, where we can laugh with you. So you write, his version of the truth has been perpetuated by the pro-Bert camp for decades. The adults at Centrepoint did nothing wrong. Only the counselors who turned a beautiful experience into an ugly one later. Harm to the children wasn't done by the community, but by the outside society. And all the girls lied in court because they wanted the ACC payout. So that was a reference to people from the group getting money. But then this is, quote, free groups are being destroyed all over the world, There was fervor in his voice. Communities are not allowed to thrive and survive because we're all seen as a threat. It's just,
so much denial, right?
you can, you get to hear and understand. And again, isn't it fascinating? It must be really fascinating from your perspective to be able to actually go and interview some of these individuals, the freedom with which they speak to you, because they also don't see anything that they're saying in their philosophy as odd, off, harmful, etc. I mean, the fact that you also got an interview with the Gloriavale leader was fascinating to me. Kind of a similar scene, where there's not, the men are not processing that what's coming out of their mouths is actually abuse and an abuse mentality.
Plus, I mean, you're right.
Take it away.
It's quite unusual. I think it's also something that really makes my book unique. I got to speak to perpetrators, some of them convicted sexual abusers, like the son of Bert Potter, John Potter, who was Louise's, one of Louise's abusers, the girl in the caravan. But to go back to what comes out of their mouth, I think the fact that they've all come out of these, or still are, like in Gloriavale, in these patriarchies and these extreme patriarchal systems, and being older white men, I think it's contributed to the fact that if they have a woman, younger woman standing in front of them, asking them something, they think they just don't understand what role I play. They think they need to mansplain to me. And they have no sense. I mean, that's another layer in all this. The fact that they are so patriarchal in their thinking that they don't even realize, here's a journalist and everything is coming out of your mouth right now can be turned against you and will end up in a book. But no. But it was mind blowing. I mean, well, it's maybe more mind blowing now for the readers, but at the time, again, it was also really conflicting for me. Uli, the drug chemist, I didn't technically have an appointment for an interview with him. Someone who I had just interviewed before, and that's a story, it's not even in the book, because she's the mother of an abused child, and I interviewed her. She later put the interview back, and it was one of these really conflicting dramas. And then her daughter got angry at me, accused me I had been too insensitive around her mother, and I'm just like any other journalist. And they've had enough of that, because they were also raised in Centrepoint to hate the media and see us as evil. Yeah. So I'd all just come from this woman, walking on eggshells a bit, but she had introduced, she said, look, let's just go up the road and meet Uli. He's there, and you can come and say hi. So it wasn't technically an interview. I just rocked up there at this big estate, and he was this fascinating guy with these suspenders with a Swiss flag on it, tried to hug me straight away, which I find a little bit uncomfortable, but he was a super friendly guy, showed me around, gave me some lunch in his kitchen, and I thought, oh God, I'm really befriending the enemy here. I mean, this is, and then he always said, no, I don't want to, we're not doing an interview, but at the same time, it was really clear that he wanted to get his message out, and that he wanted me to see things his way. And like what you just quoted there, his thing was the kids were all right. Nothing was wrong, nothing bad happened to the kids. Whatever problems they have now later in life is because they either came into Centrepoint already in a damaged way, or their parents didn't raise them in a good way, or they already had problems beforehand, or the social workers and the police implemented that in their minds later that they had been abused. And I mean, the irony of this, not only because that he went to jail for sexual child abuse, but his children didn't all turn out that well. One of his sons was later investigated by the police at Centrepoint as a young adult because he was watching child pornography on his computer. So, so the cognitive dissonance, the level of denial, it was so apparent. It's almost like this guy lives in a parallel universe here in his little sort of castle-like estate in a beautiful place in New Zealand. He had a big payout from when the Centrepoint Trust was turned over and closed. So he was one of the old survivors. He was one of the old believers who were paid out at the time with almost 50,000 New Zealand dollars. And this is a way to get them off the land. But then now there's a lot of bad blood with people who who were damaged at Centrepoint. They didn't get any money. They're left with nothing. They had put all their money into the community. And it's, there was still so much animosity, so many factions. I didn't expect that. The different factions, the infighting, also within families, where some of the, there's some families, one family where one victim who had been very prominent really dominated everything, and no one was allowed to say how they felt at Centrepoint or their abuse didn't really matter because she was the worst. She considered herself as, this is, it's her holy grail and no one can go near it. Then there are other families where the abused children, now adults, can't really speak about this because the parents are in denial, or they're telling them that it wasn't really like that, and didn't they also have a really great childhood, and didn't they live in this wonderful community? I mean, the complexity also of the families that went there. Some parents who, let their 12, 13-year-old daughters be deflowered. I mean, it's probably not the right word. I hate that word. Basically, they allowed the 60-year-old guru to have sex for the first time with these young girls because the parents thought this is a good thing. This is a good initiation, a rite of passage. Yeah. How do you fix that later on in life within your family? That this is, that your parents were not just bystanders, but even enablers of your abuse. There were cases of mothers and daughters where the mothers had this as a task from birth that, they would perform a sexual act on their boys. It's probably not because the mother was turned on by that, but they thought this is helping their children to awaken sexually. So this is how messy that was, and it gives you an idea of what I came across and how almost unsurmountable it felt. The level of shame and trauma, denial, guilt, conflicting stories, accusations, also legal stuff that maybe, could still backfire on people if I knew about this. Wow. And some of that is in the book. Yeah. It's still a lot what's in there, but it's actually the tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
I believe it, because in meeting others who have kind of studied a particular group and have interviewed a ton of survivors, I know there's only a fraction that gets into the book, and it's tremendous, really. And I'm also just appreciating, again, the so interesting that you're landing in the midst of all of this many years later, which in some ways I'm imagining could even be more complicated if there hasn't been any reparations or education or just care around the whole experience. And I think you're right, Anke. I mean, I find that anytime also where there's sexual abuse happening, it's just adding such massive layers of complexity, because there are all those questions about the family unit and who was paying attention or not. And it gets really, really complicated. So much harder.
Centrepoint was like a big incest family, really. And so you have all these roles of the ones who hide away, the ones that speak up and then get shunned and shamed by the other siblings as traitors. You have the enablers, the bystanders, and the apologists. All these roles, they are there. I learned a lot in those years, and I think, like you just said it very correctly, I just stepped into this aftermath, this unresolved big aftermath. And it's not like there was any victim organization or a group or anything online or in real life where people could find each other. There were these little factions, and also some, a pro-Centrepoint faction, and it still exists around John Potter, the son of the guru, convicted sex offender himself. So these people are also out there, and then their children who might be aware of the sexual abuse, might not doubt that that's happened, even if it hasn't happened to them, or have friends who it has happened to. But then they also love their parents, or they've seen their parents go to jail. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to process, and I have a lot of admiration also for those who finally come forward and are willing share their stories, and they've done that, and I hope it has helped. And I'm also really impressed with the Centrepoint Restoration Project. So that's a project started by a doctor here in Christchurch after that story came out. And they wrote an open letter to the adults of Centrepoint about 2 years ago, where they wanted to start a process of, reconciliation, or let's talk about, let's address what this is. Please get involved in the conversation, because us children, we need this. Yeah, we want this. We need to lift the lid. We need to heal the wounds. We can only do this by looking at it. And it's been, as far as I know, it hasn't been easy to get the adults, the first generation, to sign this letter and to be, step forward and to raise their hand and says, yes, I want to acknowledge something here. I want to show some accountability. I want to be part of that process. But that's only happening 20 years later. And the commune in Austria that I mentioned before, they had tackled that a little bit earlier, maybe also being in Europe and maybe New Zealand, different culture, people, a bit more insular, people trying to get on more, maybe it's not so outspoken, not so much into conflict resolution as the Germans or the Austrians. But in Austria, the second generation of the Otto Mühr commune, around this despotic artist who was the similar type of guy as Bert Potter was, or the similar type of community and damage, the second generation actually asked for an apology from the first generation, and there were documentaries and there were books. So they were already 10, 15 years ahead of doing the work around the carnage of that group. And then Centrepoint has taken that long. And I think, I would assume that my work has played a role in that as well. So it wasn't all a failure in the end, even though I felt like that when I gave everything up, and it was sad and awful for me and difficult. But looking back now, I think, no, I was a piece of that bigger puzzle, and it's coming together now. We're in this amazing golden age of cult reckoning, and it's also really sad to see that it has taken that long, especially if I think of someone like Louise, the girl in the caravan. Do you know, when I met her, she had never talked to anyone about this. And I came along and everything poured out of her. And it was a lot to take in. I spare you the details here on the podcast. You've read them and they're in the book, okay? And she told me she'd never seen a therapist. In fact, she once, after she had been in court, and for her court case, she'd only written everything down. After that, she felt so awful. She just walked into a women's help center, support center in Auckland, just walked in there. And then she told me the receptionist threw up into the waste bucket because of what Louise said while she was there. I mean, maybe take that with a grain of salt, but I trust, I can imagine that could have happened, knowing her story. And then that was the end of it. She's never wanted to go and see a therapist again. Now, the thing also is, if you come out of a therapy commune or community like Centrepoint, where therapy was shoved down your throat as a teenager against your will, and you were pushed into workshops where you had to process everything and scream everything out, and otherwise you'd be hauled back the next week. The kids from Centrepoint hated the jargon, just the word therapy, and everyone there was a self-proclaimed therapist. So Louise, she was afraid if she would go and seek therapy or would go for counseling around Auckland, that she would bump into one of them. She would bump into one of those therapists who were, in fact, her abusers at Centrepoint or enablers. So, that's also really complex. And then this from other cultic groups as well, and come to Gloriavale later. When you're also steeped in the, raised in a religion or a philosophy or a cultic belief that, therapists are bad or from the devil or evil, or if you need therapy, it's weakness, it's your failure. It means that you don't have enough faith. So there's already a massive cultural barrier to even seek out therapy. So the people who need it the most, that's what I learned up to Centrepoint, the people who would have needed it the most didn't get it. And even if they did get it, often people weren't really qualified to help them because they didn't understand the extent. And so a lot of Centrepoint victims in the end got sexual abuse counseling, at least. But yeah, my God, I could go on and on about this, Jennifer, but it was just such a complex thing. And I'm just a journalist, right? I had no training in how to deal with sexual abuse survivors. I don't get any supervision. I hadn't covered anything like this before. So, and here I was sitting for hours and hours with someone telling them a most intimate, horrific life story from their childhood. I mean, things that you cannot even imagine that had happened to them. And I read their poems and their letters, and they call me, and everything erupts again. And then I became a bit of a mediator as well. Or you could say I was on a crusade, because we used to see another mother from Centrepoint, a woman who had done a complete turnaround and gone from bird follower to later activist against his cult, and try to shut Centrepoint down. An amazing woman. She just passed away, sadly. She helped so many people. And I thought, well, Louise should meet her, and maybe they can talk, and maybe this woman can, be like a bit of give an apology or fill the gap that's been so obvious all these years. And I try to be a bit of a go-between there as well, between some factions and people, and which, as a journalist is not what you would normally do or what you should do. And even though I would say probably it makes my book a more fascinating read, but personally for my mental health back then, and what, it was a slippery slope. It was a slippery slope. I turned from just observer and reporter to someone who was on a mission, because I just couldn't get that these adults and the people who had helped me with a book and some of my sources who seemed very considerate and reasonable and good people, that some of them I thought they must have known this as well. They were there. I now have insight into some of these, into the cesspit that Centrepoint was for so many, while of course it was also great and for many others. How could they have not known? And I was on a moral crusade, and that really messed with me. Yeah.
That's so hard. And I also really understand, because when you're exposed to and working with people who really have such horrific stories to share and really are so innocent, and you just want to help them, and you care about them. And when you receive these stories, it's really, it's hard not to, So I very much understand that kind of pull to, and what happens, I think, also in this field is that the more we're in it, the more resources or connections we have. So then I know for myself, I tend to want to engage, to go, oh, well, can I hook you up with this lawyer? Oh, I can connect you with this survivor to see if this can happen, or, just the different overlaps or avenues of support.
I've definitely learned my lesson from this, Jennifer. When I did the second round of the book, which then became a bit of a different project with Centrepoint in it, but the other cults as well, I'd learned my lessons. So I made sure I had a support crew. I made sure I could go and see a therapist. I knew I had really good legal support. I've had someone from each group as my fact checker, and I had people really backing me, and I needed that. And just by then also knew much better how to take care of my own mental health and go for cold swims in the ocean every day and lots of walks and all these things, and listen to the right podcasts and whatnot. So I've learned the hard way what works better when you go into a project like this. But also back then, don't forget 2012, that was a few years before Me Too, the Me Too movement even kicked off. It was a different era, and we were not as trauma informed. We were not as abuse informed or in cult informed. At least I wasn't. I'm sure if you'd come out of a group, you would have always known what it is. But for me, I was still more an outsider looking in. And I think through my direct experience with these survivors, but also the effect it had on me, I learned a lot. So even though it was hard at the time and it felt like a massive failure, it was also a big learning for me, and I'm just really, really grateful for everyone who stood by me, and especially those like Angie and Louise who let me share their story in the end for the book that you now have, that they didn't give up, that they didn't go, oh God, you're not putting us through all this again, and another editor and another publisher, and oh my God, we get, they needed to really cooperate with me. So I'm really grateful, because they have no agenda as such, right? This is the history. It's done. And the good news also is Louise has actually started therapy now, finally. And every now and then we're in touch, and I'm really happy to hear this. While I just don't know if what I just don't know if that level of trauma can ever really leave you or be processed. I hope for that. I really hope for that for her. But it's been too little too late. And this is the other thing I just want to throw in before maybe we wrap up Centrepoint. Another thing which we know from across the world and other groups as well, that the authorities in New Zealand, the police, they acted too late. And in fact, actually, one person was complicit. And there was a whistleblower early on who alarmed the police and said there's sexual abuse of children happening at Centrepoint. You need to go and investigate this. And what they did was they sent a sergeant or so around who had a cup of tea with Bert Potter and sat down with him. And Bert Potter had before then, told everyone to not say anything. So he was. They were basically complicit in this. Later turned out that this policeman actually had a history of sexual abuse, and stuff, right? And the documentary that's out there, Heaven and Hell, really looks into this, and how tragic that so many children's lives could have been different had that gone differently and more professionally, and not in this completely outrageously, I can't even really find the words for it. But these kind of things, they happen again and again and again, where you think, well, where was the police? Where were the social workers? Where were the people around them? Did they not know? The school teachers, society, the journalists, And this is also why I'm so passionate about this now. I think we need more awareness, we need better journalism, and not just when something bad happens, not just the sensationalist headlines, and not just, these weird people in a sex cult, no wonder something happens there, but actually normalizing why people are there in the first place, and helping to understand who they are, and that there's a sliding scale from victim to perpetrator, and people can be both. And I've met people who were both. And it gets really complex again when we look into Gloriavale at the other end of the spectrum, and in some ways again so similar. And I wrote a piece a few years ago for a New Zealand platform, the Spinoff, where I said, have we learned nothing from Centrepoint with Gloriavale? Because a lot of the same things are repeating themselves, and you have to ask yourself, okay, so New Zealand had this massive cult scandal in the 1990s when the raids happened, when the court cases happened. But then it's almost like it's happening all over again, but with a Christian veneer in Gloriavale. So, it was time to put it all together in a book and shine a light on it for sure.
And I think this is where also when especially underage sexual abuse is happening, where things get so complicated, because it really is where, we have to help the children, right? They cannot help themselves. This is why we have laws around these issues, right? But within these communities, the whole mentality is so different, even to the extent, as you bring up in the book, of the reporting or the complaint of it, right? It just remains contained within that unit. So whatever the belief system is that leadership is carrying is what's going to transpire. And the results are going to end up being, that the little girls are shamed because they're no longer pure for their husband to no fault of their own. It's just it truly is crazy making. And this is where I agree with you that it really is where if we could have a megaphone or scream at the top of our lungs, it's around these, when there are kids involved, because.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one thing. talking about adults who were abused in cults, and who went in there as adults, who chose this, even though they didn't choose the abuse and they didn't choose like the cultic side of the group. But it's another conversation if you were raised there, or if your parents brought you there and you had no other choice. And at Centrepoint, a lot of children were brought there, and this was suddenly their new home, and there was no way out, and became like a prison. This is what Louise is calling it. It was a prison, and there was no escape from her. And she literally escaped into the bush at night, slept in little rabbit hutches to escape from those men. And I was on that land for my reporting. I went there. I hugged the tree that I know Louise had hugged. I was involved in a ceremony there where people tried to clean the land. So for me, it was so close sometimes, thinking, well, this is where all this has happened, where kids had amazing adventures and lived in groups and loved the food and the freedom they had. And at the same time, this was also happening. And that these two things go together. But then one side is not to understand how big the damage is. Also, if it's been your home, if this has been your identity, your religion, your world, it's like being a refugee from another country, coming to a completely new continent with a different language almost, where you don't understand the rules. And so apart from the trauma that's happened, or the sexual abuse that has happened, it's also the finding yourself again afterwards. And I've heard this over and over again from everyone I've interviewed, that the struggles of them reintegrating into our normal society been huge. And Angie always looking for love, looking for sex, looking for the cuddles, becoming a sex addict, a prostitute, ended up in she was an alcoholic and almost killed herself, and amazingly turned her life around in the end. But always looking for something that she had at Centrepoint. Well, at the same time, she was drug raped by Bert Potter. Oh, well, I could go on and on, but yeah.
Well, also, this might feel like a bit of a jump, but as we go into kind of this next phase, perhaps because we're on the child conversation, I did actually have a question for you. I was curious because, when Wild Wild Country came out, I knew enough about that history to just know that it seemed like a miss to me that the children's stories were not told in that documentary. And I've wondered why. And I actually interviewed a little while ago Lily Dunn. I don't know if you're familiar with her. Yeah. So she's amazing. And we discussed, I was asking her a little bit about this and why this hasn't kind of come out. And she was saying that, so she has a history of being in that group as a child, but she didn't have the same maybe amount of time or exposure that, some of the ones who were truly kind of raised in that group had. And she was saying that for her, it was difficult to get the story out really because she wasn't kind of part of that inner group. But I thought, how interesting as well that truly it's like the group of child survivors, now adults, when this dynamic happens, it's almost like the group has to find the person or filmmaker or what have you to share the story, because it has to be done also in the right way, or a way that they feel respected in it. So, but it is actually quite shocking to me that these stories have not really come out. Is that also your understanding right now, or did you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it takes a certain age maybe. And even when I went to the ICSA conference, that was 2018, so 5 years ago, there was a Jehovah's Witness survivor, and they were just beginning to put something together and start, collaborate internationally. I think she's from Australia. And that's now, in Hare Krishnas as well. The kids were raised in the Hare Krishna boarding schools, and who've come out of that cult and the abuse that they've suffered, or the stories they have to tell. I think it had to take that long because they have to be adults first, be educated. The internet's help, survivor groups, cult resources. So suddenly they're ready and they can join the conversation. But oh my God, I mean, in terms of Osho and the sannyasins and the whole Orange movement, I've always, I mean, at least for the last 20 years, I would say, I've been aware of some of these stories. So as long as the internet's around, I was already in some groups in Australia where a lot of people from the ranch in Oregon had then resettled there, and there were some people talking about this, not so much in we want to make this public and we want to, not so much in an activist role, but more sharing how conflicting it was, or how they were also sticking together as kids from that scene because the others, on the outside didn't really understand. And there was a death, and so I already had this on my radar, the kids from the commune, so to speak. So it was very fitting that I then spoke to kids from the commune here in New Zealand with Centrepoint, because they were in a similar boat, but definitely more extreme at Centrepoint, but similar themes in these Osho communities as well. As we're only just hearing from it. Look, when I went to India in 2017 and visited Osho's former ashram there, now a meditation resort, quite upmarket, quite slick, very zen. Went in there.
I have to just quickly interject, Anke. Yeah. This also was an area where I was loving my experience of your humor, is that we get these one little liners that get dropped in. So particular around the whole Osho complex experience with your husband, I was just dying. Some of the little comments that you would make about it.
Oh, how I got sick from Sufi dancing, right? Yes. Not food poisoning, but Sufi dancing. Yeah, I mean, some light humor I think helps after the heaviness of these Centrepoint chapters. So yeah, I did put that in there, even though it was not an investigation. I really just went there out of curiosity, and this was in those years. After the Centrepoint book had folded, but I was still on my own journey, so to speak, into some groups that fascinated me. And because a lot of them were, had to do with neo-Tantra, or a lot of things were taught there, Osho suddenly came up again.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode, and please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the Season 2 song written by Jaya Suri, and for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.